there was a time like very early on when we were starting Lyft, where I remember like the bank had not approved our payment gateway, so we couldn't actually like generate revenue. But the business was like started. Like the booking engine was open, and our flights were scheduled, and there was some like bureaucratic delay on the bank actually giving us the thumbs up to accept payments. And I had to like use all my contacts to go to the head of FNB at the time and say like, do you really want to be screwing up startup businesses in South Africa with your bureaucracy?
Tell me what your anything that you've experienced with or relate to podcasts.
Yes. So I'm not alone. On that podcast, I probably spend a lot of time consuming podcasts and trying to learn about what's happening in the world through various podcasts. So one of our businesses is called Circle Senior Living. It's a retirement living business. We build retirement residences and we sell life rights for people, older people to come and live there for the rest of their lives, basically. So my fascination was really the psychology of older people and what their fears are, what their aspirations are, because I'm very sensitive to the fact that old people are often forgotten and the rich knowledge that they have is forgotten and not leveraged in the world. And I really wanted to get into the heads of older people. And so I started a podcast called Rock Timed, which was really the idea that retirement can actually rock and can be a just a very rich phase of life, depending on how it's approached and depending on the circumstances. It can be a very rich phase of life. So I started interviewing older people, and the funnest one I did was a lady that was turning 100. Her name is Avril Kentridge, just a remarkable lady. And so I just sat down with her, and her grandson brought her to the interview, and she couldn't hear everything I was saying, so I had to repeat the questions a few times. But she was just remarkable. She remembered stories from when she was a little girl growing up in England, and she was, reflecting on these stories and also how hard it is to grow old and to have pain all over and to, and the fears that she has of, not being able to do stuff. So it was fun. It was really fun. I enjoyed it.
Cool. I mean, it's interesting that you're running this podcast. Something that I've been thinking about is also, so I'm 25, right? And you go through life and sometimes you think your challenges or your doubts are unique, but probably they're not. And there's people, because as you mentioned, they've been there, right? They live through these doubts and challenges. Is that something that resonates with you?
For sure. It's just learned so much talking to people. Like I always found I find every person I meet interesting. In fact, I'll give you one other idea I had about a podcast, which I'm probably never going to do. But the podcast was going to be called the Random Podcast. And the idea was to find a person completely randomly and to interview them and just find out about their life. Not curated and not nothing, but just to get into the heads of just people that you would have maybe walked past in the street and thought that that's just an ordinary person. But everybody's got a story, everybody's got experiences. And as you say, everybody has something that you can learn from. And maybe I'll do it one day. The Random Podcast, don't forget.
Great. Call me up when that happens. What's a revealing question, by the way? If you were to meet someone who was here, what's something more revealing questions to ask? You're doing all my work, by the way, right?
Just like what got you to where you are, and what do you aspire towards? What are the things you dream about? Because I think everybody's got dreams, but oftentimes they're on the back burner because life is hard and maybe they've had struggles and they given up on their dreams. And so I think a lot of the work that I do, and maybe what we'll talk about, is just trying to unpack. But what are those things that are waiting to emerge? What are those aspirations that people have that haven't come to the fore? And how does one unleash that? Because if you can, whether it's in a business or an organization, I think magic can happen. But it's at a personal level. It's at a level of people wanting to do more, with themselves, and having the support and the belief that they can actually do stuff.
Was there a moment in your life when that awareness of when that switched, when you figured out, hey, I need to do, I have certain goals and certain aspirations that I want to make true? Was there sort of a turning point in your life that explains why you think this way?
Well, I think I've always been restless. So I've always been, even today, at 56 years old, I wake up every morning and I'm restless. I want to do stuff. I want to do more stuff. And I have this constant feeling that I'm never going to get to do all the things I want to do. So that makes me like even a little bit anxious, but excited as well. So I think I've always had that energy of doing stuff. And also, grew up in an environment where so many of the things that I did and I tried to do didn't work out, but it was okay. And it was, it was not, there was always another chance, and there was always the support to do stuff from my parents, from, the people I ended up hanging around, my friends, ultimately my business partners that I ended up getting into businesses with. So I think I've just always had that sense that it's worth giving things a go. Most of them, in my experience, actually don't work out. I mean, my ratio of, if you have to call it failures to success, is way more than half. But fortunately, there's a percentage that have worked and that been enriching and energizing and confidence building. And so that's the story. Just keep going.
So obviously you could talk for a long time about your background, but I like asking one particular question, which is, what's one part of your story that explains sort of the career you sort of completed, or the career you went through, or you've gone through, or the things that currently excite? Was an element of your background that I would need to know to better understand you as a person today and what drives you currently?
Yeah. So I grew up, I was finishing school in the late 80s, early 90s. And then my career path, which was kind of driven, I think, a lot by my parents, and in particular my father, was to train as an accountant, as a CA, which is, at that time, that was kind of, if you had half a brain and you were kind of interested in business, you would go and study accounting. So that's what I ended up doing. And I just didn't love it at all, and after studying for like 4 or 5 years, I then had to go and work in an accounting firm for 3 years to do my articles. So it was just very difficult for me to, like engage in that. I found it completely uninteresting, and so, but at that time, I think careers were much narrower. So it was much more like, what are you going to be doing? And, when you're 18 years old, you kind of decided your career path, which was quite unfortunate in a way. So that took me to, let's say, my mid-20s. And then I went to the US. Now, the timing of that was 1996. And I went to study there for 2 years in Chicago. And apart from the fact that I loved the experience and met people from all over the world and learned lots of things, and got quite a deep immersion into American culture, which at the time was quite aspirational. I think today I see it completely differently, but that's a separate issue. there were two things that that stuck with me a lot. The one was the evolution of technology, and obviously now it's all AR. At that time, it was all internet, it was all online, and it was brand new. So when I got to my university dorm room in Chicago, the first thing I did was connected my laptop, which I just got, into an Ethernet cable, which gave me access to high-speed internet, which when I left South Africa, we didn't even have dial-up internet. And suddenly I was connected to the world, and suddenly there were all these businesses and things emerging in the online world. So that completely fascinated me. And I spent a lot of time, immersed in that world of technology and innovation and evolution. And interestingly enough, I also got very interested in marketing. So while all my training was, numbers and finance, I found it really boring. I found it very retrospective, looking at financial performance. And even to this day, people send me financial report. I find it's hard work for me to do. I can do it. I can look at it. I can understand it, but I hate it. I want to be looking into the future. How can we change things? How can we do things differently? How can we use technology to do things better? And how can we use just human ingenuity and creativity to build things? So that moment, I think, just almost like a transitionary moment where I saw the light of possibility rather than, retrospective analysis of facts was, I think, the change in my world.
You spent an incredible amount of your time in the aviation industry.
Yeah.
And you also have a family background that relates to the aviation industry.
So it's a bit random in a way. It's amazing how random things are. But my father, who trained as a chartered accountant, so my father, just like in a nutshell, came from like a very, very poor background. His parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They found refuge in South Africa. They escaped the Holocaust. They landed in South Africa. So he grew up in a very poor background and wanted to change his life and wanted to have a life that was not a stroke. And he trained part-time as a chartered accountant. And his first job was in an aviation company, which was involved in aircraft, buying, selling aircraft, and then also an airline business. So, and as a kid growing up, all I knew was airplanes. There were always planes. We would go airplanes. I would have posters of airplanes in my room. And in the school holidays, I would go with my father to the airport where he worked, and I would sit in the cockpit of an airplane for hours and hours, pretending I was flying the plane. So that was my world. So I almost had this thing that I had to do something in this industry. Now, what I didn't know is what a difficult industry it is. It's a very challenging industry for many reasons, which we can go into if you would like. But it was an industry that I was just drawn to. I loved flying. I learned to fly. I got a pilot's license, and I was probably not a particularly great pilot, but it was fun to learn. And but I always had a thing for aviation and flying, and got involved in the industry ultimately, and spent many years in and out of the industry. I'm looking at a project now, which I'm not going to tell you that much about because it's top secret, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. In the aviation space, which could be really interesting. But yeah, so that was my entry point into airlines.
Tell me, I'll be wondering what makes the aviation industry so challenging. You hear COVID, right?
Yeah.
That must have had an enormous impact on the aviation industry. You hear now the news of Strait of Hormuz, right?
Yeah.
Tremendous impact on the aviation industry. Tell me, how does the aviation industry work, and why is it so complicated to do business in the aviation industry?
So it's quite interesting. Scott Galloway, the man of he was trying to project where AR is going, and he said, is there a possibility that AR becomes almost like the airline industry, where it's this critical piece of infrastructure? I mean, the world without airlines is very problematic, just in terms of distribution of goods across the world, and obviously people and connectivity. When there have been times when there have not been flights, COVID, or whatever the issue is, the war in Iran, it has a massive impact on people, on the economy. So you've got this critical piece of infrastructure, but it doesn't. If you look at the profit history or the performance history of airlines since 1900, when the Wright brothers first flew, the first aircraft, it's been a disaster. There's been like negative profitability, which is very unusual. So as an industry, it's a very critical industry, but the value is not extracted by operators of airlines. Now, there are exceptions, and it's important to note that like any industry, there are players that do very well. I mean, and we can talk about some of those examples. And fortunately, the airlines that I've been involved with have done well. Now, that's not to say we didn't have some very difficult periods and stressful times, but generally we did well in a difficult industry. Why is that the case? There's the kind of traditional reasons. Very high fixed costs, so you've got to commit to massive capital expenditure, and very volatile input costs, fuel. We've seen what's happened in the last year or so, and then I think the biggest challenge is the pricing power of most airlines is pretty quick. So you don't have pricing power. You don't have the ability to price the product at a consistently profitable depth. And because this is my main fit, because airlines have what they think is this very clever thing of variable pricing. So when you book your flight, you don't know whether it's going to cost you $100 or $1,000. It depends when you book. It depends on the season, the time of day, how long in advance you book, etc., etc., etc. So airlines are the masters at adjusting price. But with that comes, I think, a very poor pricing discipline. So industries that do well are industries that price at a point that is profitable, where there's margin. And there's almost like this competitive dynamic that says, well, that's where we're going to price, and we're not going to have excessive price competition, because that's going to be a race to the bottom. And unfortunately, airlines often involve themselves in a race to the bottom. So even though they have this very valuable service that they offer, I think that their pricing power gets eroded because of this the structure that's in place in the industry, and because of the fact that airlines, I think, if not. So where airlines do very well, that, for example, in the US for the last 10 years, it's basically been an oligopoly of the major carriers. So the authorities allowed these major mergers to take place, and they don't compete heavily on profit. So they all make money. They all do, pretty well, and that's the way it works. And then you've got airlines like Ryanair, who just have like a massive scale and cost advantage, and they do very well because they just really, if you look at it as a commodity industry, they are the lowest cost producer, and they do very well. And I've always been, obviously very understanding of the efficiencies required to run a good airline, but also very conscious of the fact that it's a service business. So even though you're just doing a job on the one hand of moving somebody safely from one place to another, it's still a service, and there's still many, many dimensions to the service that can be improved, that one can focus on to create differentiation and to create ultimately a price premium that people are prepared to pay for being looked after better than their competitors. So I've always been really interested in that, and a lot of my focus has been on just creating differentiation, not only on the product side, but on the distribution side, on the partnership side. I love building partnerships with other businesses and collaborating, because I think a lot of value can be unlocked in that way. I'm talking a lot, but hopefully that gave you a little bit of a sense of the crazy airline industry.
How were your ventures looking back in terms of overall success, also financial success, how you reflect on this?
Yeah. I mean, first it was never me alone. I mean, I've, and it sounds cliche that there's always a team involved. Oftentimes a co-founder. And for example, with Lyft, I worked with a guy called Jonathan Ayash, who actually his career before that was with Uber, and he left Uber and we started Lyft together, and he was just exceptional. I mean, he had all the discipline and understanding of technology and scale and people that he had picked up at Uber, and just applied it to an industry that he knew nothing about, but just did it brilliantly well. So obviously people at the core of it, there's the wrong team, the wrong leadership, you got no chance, particularly in an industry as hard as airlines. I think the two, could talk maybe about Lyft because it's a little bit fresh and many people won't remember Kalula, and unfortunately it ultimately failed long after I had left. But Lyft was an interesting, because Lyft came very strange time. It came during COVID, and who wants to start an airline in COVID? It was actually the perfect time because aircraft were cheap and people were available to jump on board, and competitors were struggling. So it was actually the perfect time. And it was just about doing everything a bit better, being better on the technology, having a thing called a Lyft wallet, which was, if you want to cancel your flight or change your flight, it's not a big deal. You just get a credit in your wallet, and there's no fees and fuss. But and those kind of things became big deals. And instead of having to pay for food on board and have that whole awkward interaction with the cabin attendant to buy a cup of coffee, we got free to eat to come on board, and we did a deal with them, and customers got a beautiful cup of coffee on board. So there were all these things, but most importantly, we had just amazing people in a culture that people wanted to be a part of and were happy to be at work and were empowered to make decisions and do what they needed to do on board to make customers happy, and it just worked really well. And so that, very brief summary, but
Was there a particular moment during that career? Because you just mentioned it. I mean, I've not been in the aviation industry at all. And I think, as you mentioned, it's really complex. I'll be wondering, have you ever, or can you share with us a particular situation where this complicated dynamic of, the fuel topic, which is quite important in the aviation industry, the planes that you have to lease, or this dynamic of complicated things that sum up to a very challenging situation. Do you have a moment in time that you can share with me where this that complicated dynamic just make things very challenging for you and your career? Was there a moment? Because I think that's a very interesting way of maybe conveying to me how tough the aviation industry may be. That's how I imagine it. Is there a particular example you can share?
sure, there's so many. I mean, it's like, and I suppose it's like almost like trauma that's been built up over so many of these kinds of experiences, where it always becomes normal to have like a survival challenge, whether it's a competitor that's trying to draw here on business, cutting fares, to ridiculous levels, or COVID, a director saying you're not allowed to fly for the next 2 months, but you've still got your overhead to cover. So I've found, I'm avoiding your question a little bit to think of a specific moment, but so many moments where, like, like we had to be there was a time like very early on when we were starting Lyft, where I remember like the bank had not approved our payment gateway, so we couldn't actually like generate revenue, but the business was like started, like the booking engine was open and our flights were scheduled, and there was some like bureaucratic delay on the bank actually giving us the thumbs up to accept payments. And I had to use all my contacts to go to the head of FNB at the time and say do you really want to be screening up startup businesses in South Africa with your bureaucracy? And eventually they fixed it. But I think there are those moments where where it's a do or die, and you do what you can do, and you do it as a team, and it actually becomes. I often say in all the so I was Lyft was, let's say, a 4-year experience. The hardest times were often the funnest times, like when we were solving problems like that, because we were doing it collectively, we were doing it with great smart people, and we were solving problems. Because every day, business, from my experience, business is solving problems. So if you're out there and you're thinking, should I do business, or is business for me? If you like solving problems, then business may well be for you. If you hate problems, then stay away from business, because there's always problems. Sometimes good problems, sometimes not such good problems. Yeah. It's problem solved.
You were saying that the hard moments are fun moments?
Yeah, really.
Is it only is it only retrospectively, or rather, is it also the moment the case?
I think when you're in something and you're fighting and you're sitting around and you're trying to figure things out, it can be it's enriching. Now, is it fun at the time? I don't know if fun's maybe not the right word, but it's enriching. And when you look back, it's like, we got through that. We survived, and we made it clear, and we figured it out. And at the time, it's like, geez, are we actually going to get through this? And you do get through it.
But my question is rather whether it is fun or whether it's fun retrospectively, especially, or is it really fun moment? Because we tend to also, look back on things with nostalgia. And is that maybe the way it is, or do you also like that intensity? Have you learned maybe through that career to enjoy that intensity in some shape or form? Is it?
Yeah, I think let's say at a spiritual level, because I spend a lot of time doing yoga now, and what I'm trying to learn is to, whatever the emotion is, whatever the circumstance is, just being in it and being with it and being present with it, and not trying to resist it because it's there and it's real, and whether it's a feeling of joy and happiness or a feeling of anxiety and fear, these are real things, and I've learned firstly that these circumstances and emotions are all transient. They change. So as bad as things are, and as anxious as you may be about a circumstance, it is going to change, and you are going to feel good about something and excited about something. And the problem that you have is not going to always be a problem. There's going to be something else that replaces it. So I think just the mindset of it's part of life. Life is lots of good stuff and challenges and exciting stuff and euphoric moments, and it's also got all the other stuff. And I think what I'm learning to do is just trying to embrace this full package of life and this full package of business, it's a package. And I think an acceptance of the package is a good step towards, embracing it and accepting it. That this is part of, this is an endeavor that's got all the good and the bad all bundled into one.
But did you already have these spiritual coping mechanisms in place when you were, the middle of that fire, or not? Because you just mentioned that you got into yoga. Was it something you already practiced sort of throughout your career as a coping mechanism to become more resilient, or is it something that are you still building?
Are you still building? It's still building and still building. Just still building more, trying to build more awareness, trying to build more skills to deal with situations better, to be more present. For me, like exercise and yoga is one of those forms of, let's say, physical activity, even though it's got a very deep, kind of internal component to it. that is my remedy to the stress, to the challenges. It's just to move my body. To this morning 7 o'clock on the mountain, running in the mountain. That's with my beautiful dog, and that is my that is my remedy. That keeps me in check. That keeps me it keeps me sane.
Gidon, what are you currently working on? What are the big topics that you're currently exploring, current ventures? My understanding, in Mox actively in the aviation industry at this anymore. Tell me, what's currently top of mind for you in terms of benches that you're working on?
Yeah. So I tend to get involved in too many things. So I haven't found a remedy for that ailment, if you want to call it that. So I do get very excited to back ventures that are, challenging a new space and taking on something that has social impact, whether it's a business or a non-profit organization. The organization that I spend a lot of time on and thinking about is SA Harvest, which is a food rescue organization. What is food rescue? Basically, an organization that accesses so a third of food produced in South Africa gets thrown out. Perfectly good food that could have been consumed gets wasted for many reasons. And at the same time, about 10 million people don't have enough access to good food. So SA Harvest bridges that gap and accesses food from farms, from factories, from stores that would have gone to waste, collects all the food as much as it can, and through its logistics system, trucks, warehouses, and gets that food into the hand of beneficiary organizations that can provide meals to its recipients. It's been growing dramatically. We're doing about 30 million meals a year, and we're only scratching the surface. So I'm spending a lot of time on that. I see it, is it a business? It's not a business. It's a not-for-profit, but I think about it like a business. It's got to have the best team. It's got to have investment. It's got to use technology smartly. It's got to understand its customer base. So I'm quite enjoying this endeavor of using business thinking and business skills and organizational skills to build something that I think is like just such a fundamental pillar of this country, country where, as you can be one of the lucky ones or the not so lucky ones. And there's too many not so lucky ones and that need support. That support, for the most part, doesn't come from government. Government has let them down and let the country down in terms of building prosperity and building economic growth and building opportunity. Government's not going to do that. So I think it's important to collectively use our skills that we've been able to learn and just apply it to things that have an impact on society. So I spend a lot of time on that, as well as the business ventures, where I'm trying not to start new things, although there are some things that I'm getting involved in starting things from scratch. As you'll know, is very difficult and very time consuming and very stressful. And yeah, it's 56. I'm not sure how many more new things I'll start from scratch myself. However, finding people that I can work with that have, the energy and enthusiasm and intellectual capability and personality to start things, I find very interesting to find people that I can support and back.
There's a lot to unfold in the answer. I think one topic which I'm particularly interested in, because we talked about it previously, is sort of the food topic. It seems to be very much important, dear topic to you. And I want you to know, to make it maybe a bit more tangible.
Yeah.
What's something when you talk to anyone, maybe friends, other operators, people in your business, in the industry, what's something when you tell them that catches their attention, that just highlights how important it is to do something in that space? What's something I should know about food rescue to really get that it's really relevant here?
Yeah. Well, I think none of us likes to feel hungry. It's a horrible feeling. I was reading a book about hostages and the experience that hostages had, being held captive for months and months, and they were abused, they were lonely, they were uncertain, they were cold, they were all these things, which they said all of those things were manageable. What was unmanageable was the hunger, that feeling of hunger. So it's like, and I love food. Often, like, I love the experience of eating food, and particularly in a communal environment. I find it enriching. I find it social, and so I've always lived with this thing of, like, on the one hand, like, enjoying food and looking forward to dining and cooking, and then on the other hand, like, being aware that like, of all this food that's going to waste, and you can see it. You can see it in your house. You can see it, in a restaurant. You can see it in a shop. You can see it on a farm. All this, all this waste. So you go to a function and there's all this beautiful food, and then you leave the function. You say, "Oh, the fuck, what's going to happen with all this food? It's this beautiful. It's just going to be thrown out." And in South Africa, like 5 minutes or 10 minutes from wherever you are, there's people that would love to have that food. So it's always just bothered me. Coming back to the airline example, so we had catering on flights, and we would have all this food, and then the flight would end, and they would chuck out the food. And there were, there all these laws around, food safety, and you couldn't take the food off. And it just killed me that we would have all this excess that had to be thrown out in, 10 minutes from the airport. I knew about these communities that would have loved to get their food. So that was kind of the obsession, if you like, of trying to figure out a solution to a problem. I love the idea of using the existing resources to create value, and that's what this does. The resources are there, the food is there. It's just got to be coordinated better. And we know well that smart thinking and the right people and technology, and we're all excited by AI and what it can do. Can AI, for example, do more to give people access to food? It absolutely can. So, my big thing now is to just think and make sure we're applying AI to things that, we all love AI, and it's going to make our businesses better, and it's going to make us more productive and organized. And, we all, hopefully we pass that point of every conversation being new comedy. What I did with AI, it's like getting a little bit boring now. I don't know if you find it. Everyone's got their story.
It's like the COVID story.
It's different. So it's not, I just want to say, it's all my friends out there. Next time we meet, I don't want to hear about what you just did in AI. I'm not interested. Unless you helping people, live better lives, which I think is important.
Gidon, I think what's really interesting about that discussion is, so I'm totally privileged from my background, right? I grew up in Germany. I've had the chance to live in, like, I was never, feeling hungry, and cannot complain. And now, as you mentioned, noticing these debates of AI, and I follow a lot of the conversations that are happening in Silicon Valley through social media, and you hear people saying, no, there's not going to be any jobs left, and all these narratives, which are very scary to people. And I think it neglects that there's still problems to be solved on this earth, right? So there's a bubble. And I see it in Germany, where people are going, they're really becoming obsessive about their health and wellness and longevity, which is fine. And I'm also aware of it. I think you also have your story there, but people also becoming very obsessive and hyper-obsessive, hyper-optimizing themselves.
Brian Johnson.
Yeah, feeling that there's nothing to be solved because AI is there. What do you tell those people? Because apparently, if you look at other parts of the world, there is a lot of problems to be solved. I mean, in my lifetime, there's probably going to be enough problems to be solved. What do you say about that? Is it something that resonates with you? Or
Well, let's do both. Let's do both. Let's find ways to live longer. Fantastic. All the latest drugs and GLP-1s and all this stuff. Uh, Technology, AI making our lives more efficient, more effective, making our businesses more efficient. These are great things. Like, why would we not use them? But just the flip side of that is, firstly, there is this fear. Is it, am I going to lose my job? We don't know the answer. Holistically, we don't know the answer. Obviously, some people will lose their jobs. But I think the deeper question is like, how can technology be used to dramatically improve the lives of people? And the solutions are obvious. In our case, more efficient food distribution systems, healthcare. Obviously, AI should ultimately provide much greater access to healthcare than what currently exists. Security, security is a major issue in South Africa. People feeling safe in their homes. There's no reason why, with the technology available, with cameras, with AR, that people shouldn't be 100% safe where they live, with 24-hour monitoring systems that detect any kind of threat to people's security. And then obviously education, there's no reason why people shouldn't have access to the best tools, the best education, starting with connectivity. I mean, we still live in a country where many people, millions of people don't have basic connectivity. Now, should that not be a basic human right? Interestingly, in the South African Constitution, access to adequate food it's a basic human right. So it's actually something that the country has to provide its citizens, is access to it, which clearly it doesn't. So I would add connectivity to that, because if you're not connected, you got no chance. So I have to do a shout out to a friend. His name's Alan Craig, and he's got a company called Fibertown, and Fibertown is just rolling out these incredible networks in communities to give people very, very affordable access to connectivity, and that's just brilliant that happens. And hopefully, satellites in town will, make that much more accessible to many more people. But those are good things.
But Gidon, I have to get back to that topic. I mean, you are doing something, obviously, with your food topic now. I'd be really curious to hear what are sort of the next milestones. You already mentioned how many meals you're providing per year. Very curious to hear that vision. But beyond that, how do we get from point A to point B, right? You mentioned all these things, you hear it everywhere. How do we make sure, as a society, as business people, that we get from point A, status quo, to point B, improving these things? Is there any way to track these any metrics, to celebrate these wins? You're just mentioning it, that we want to do both things simultaneously, right? Make our business more efficient with AI, but also working on these basic things like food, connectivity, security. How do we do that in an appropriate and also trackable way?
Yeah. Well, the trackability, I think, is the easy part, because everything's trackable now, and everything is tracked now. So I think measuring stuff and understanding stuff that's out there, like, there's no excuse not to do it. There's no excuse not to have all the information that exists in the world about your particular issue. It's all there. So, that time of spending months or years of understanding something can happen in weeks. So that's all. So that is, I think, a question of which I'm finding quite interesting in the context of AI, because everything's now accelerated and all the information, the access to information and analysis is all there. So that does it. So then what's left is to take that step and do something tangible, physical, to move in a direction, whether it's to start a business or to start a non-profit. You can do that now. I had a conversation actually earlier today with the CEO of SA Hollis, and we were talking about the initiative, and the conclusion was, just do it. We don't need to do more analysis and get more information. We can trust it, we can test it. And I really do think the current technological environment is allowing us with the tools to experiment more and experiment quicker and get moving, because that's the only way you can achieve that you can make progress is to take a step forward, do an experiment or do lots of experiments, see what works. If it works, do more of it. If that works, figure out how to scale it into something, much, much bigger. So I think just take that step forward.
So if we take SA Harvest, for instance, as a case study, what's the roadmap ahead? What are the next milestones? How do you make sure to stay this? I really, and also explain to me that idea of doing something in a non-profit way, but you don't really identify with the pure non-profit definition of your organization, right? You want to utilize business scalable mechanisms. How do you make sure that you reach and that you have an impact, that you track that over time? What's sort of your contribution to that part of the story with SA Harvest? I'd be very curious to learn more where this may be heading, into what elements of business you're using to make this a success and real impact to get this to people's lives, right?
Yeah. I think, again, like anything, the concept needs to be proved. So whatever you're doing, if it's business, go non-profit, but prove the concept. Make sure that any interested person, maybe a funder or a partner or a beneficiary, sees that the model works. There's value that's been created. So I think once you've proven that you created value, and you've only solving a very small part of the problem, and the problem is much, much bigger, or the market is much, much bigger, I think that's an easier thing to get your head around, because then it's about scale. And then it's, almost like, it's formulaic. How do you repeat what you're doing? How do you repeat it, more efficiently every time you do it? And that becomes the challenge. Again, systems, of course, but people, that ultimately it's like, can you find that magical group of people? And fortunately, we have at SA Harvest, just like the best. And this is a non-profit, and you would think, well, non-profits, you're not going to find the best people. We've been very, very conscious of finding the best people to execute this mission. And they're going to figure out they're going to solve the problems that we were talking about earlier, because, they problem solve. But the short challenge there is just scale. It's always how to build scale. We talk about we enabling 30 million meals a year, and people say, well, that's fantastic. And so thank you, that's great. But we actually need to be doing, billions of meals a year that people need to get access to, that they don't currently have access to. And, we may not solve that ourselves. We may need to be collaborating with others and partnering with others. And in fact, we definitely need to be collaborating with others and partnering with others. For example, there's a logistics company, and I'll give them a shout out, for Vector Logistics. They're one of the biggest and most competent logistics providers. And we partner with them, and they have a lot of excess capacity on some of their routes, and they will carry food that we don't have the capacity to carry. So that's one way of scaling. So again, I love the thing. Obviously, Uber's the overused case study. How do you leverage what's there and just create a platform that can just leverage all these pieces and all these resources and all these skills and things, and then I think you really can scale. I mean, isn't that the scalable model?
Instead of saying, hey, we want to have X million meals provided by next year, you are stating the problem, which is we eat billions of meals provided only to South Africans.
Yeah.
And that's already the answer to what you're aiming for, what kind of impact you want to have.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, because in business, I would assume, you've been in business, sometimes you make up numbers, right? Milestones, that's what we want to hit. But maybe they're not necessarily associated with a problem that needs to be solved. So it's just my impression that I've had. It's interesting to also get an impression of the impact that's needed, because 30 million already sounds quite high to an ordinary person, but billions sounds a lot higher, and shows how important the topic is carried.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I learned, actually, I spent a few years working at Discovery for an amazing guy who you might have heard of called Adrian Gore. And, he's one of the top business leaders in South Africa and just an incredible guy. And he always talked about goal setting. He said, like, when people set goals, typically, there's their loss aversion comes to play. So they don't want to lose. So they'll set a goal that's 35 million meals. And I say, well, we want to get to 35 million meals because then I can be sure that I'm going to achieve my goal and I'm not going to cut this feeling of loss. And he said, well, it's the wrong way to think about goals. You should set a goal that you're probably not going to achieve, but even if you don't achieve it, you would have done incredibly well. So I've, I think that's really important. And I suppose Musk is the ultimate example of that. Like he just said stuff that people originally, said it's ridiculous, and Mars and data centers in space sounds ridiculous, but then as each day goes by, maybe it will work, and maybe there will be some data centers in space in the next year. Who knows? So I think it's a good way to approach it, but there's a fine line because I think there's a credibility issue as well. Like if you just go and throw out crazy numbers and and you're asking people for money, they're going to roll their eyes at you. So I think they fine line between practical delivery. You talk about measurement, monetary, and aspirational goals. I think that's really where the needle that you've got to thread.
You just mentioned Adrian. I'm not from South Africa, but I already heard that he's quite important.
Yeah.
You worked with him.
Yeah.
I think he even published a book.
Yes, indeed. I haven't read it, but I will.
Yeah. So what have you learned from him, working with him? Because you just mentioned that. Is there something that you've learned from him or maybe from other people down, throughout your career, other mentors, coaches? I really believe in mentorship and learning from each other. I think it's also very core to Counter, but like learning from each other, and you can do it across different dimensions, generations, geographies, industries. But what's something you've heard from the Adrian or any other person of the career?
I mean, he's a brilliant guy, but I would say the strongest resonance with me is his optimism. I mean, he's just got this incredibly consistent and obsessive optimism, which is quite unusual because like it's so easy to just not be optimistic or not always be optimistic and go through periods of being less optimistic. I mean, I'm an optimistic guy, but there are times when I have some doubts and is it going to work? And I just can't. And I think it's real. I don't think it's a show. I think it's like a genuinely optimistic person, and I think that there's a currency in that is almost infectious with people around you, and that's what's such a strong leadership trait. If it's genuine optimism, if you genuinely see a world or a business that is improving and growing and having more impact over time, ultimately it does. I mean, it's just a strange thing. So,
wonderful. Gidon, thank you very much for sharing that. One final question I'd like to ask is, what's a major misconception that people have about whether about your career or about the topic as a harvest, food, anything you'd like to share where you feel like it's usually overlooked, something you would like to share with me about the topics that we discussed today?
I don't know. I don't know what people perceive. I know that we place way too much focus on what other people may or may not think. I mean, I certainly have. I've been over concerned, and I think age helps with that. Like, I really do care less and less about what people think or may think or what I think they may think. I mean, what I've learned is that people actually don't think. They think typically about themselves, which is fine. They don't spend their days thinking about you. And so I think it's a distraction to worry about what other people think. I think what's important is to back yourself and have that feeling inside that what you're doing is right. It fits with your aspirations, and I mean, you wake up in the morning and if the mission that you're on is the mission that you should be of. And that's the most important thing.